Thank you for joining us today as we share the findings from the latest ITRC Consumer Aftermath Study, a report that looks at the impacts on the victims of identity crimes. I'm James Lee, COO of the ITRC, and I'm joined today by our CEO, Eva Velasquez, along with two special guests, John Breyault with the National Consumers League and a member of the ITRC board, and Brandn Green, a research scientist from DSG, a leading social science research and management consulting firm that helped conduct part of the research we're discussing today. For nearly 20 years, the ITRC has been asking identity crime victims who contact us how they've been impacted by their particular identity crime. Beyond the usual question of how much money did you lose? When the first report was issued in 2003, identity crimes and crime rates were very different. Back then, you were more likely to be the victim of an identity crime as a result of you physically losing control of something, a credit card, your mail, leaving your laptop computer in your car. Today, most identity crimes can be traced to some form of cyber attack, which has resulted in personal information being compromised and ultimately misused. The criminal may be someone known to the victim or a professional cyber thief, but no matter who commits the offense, the victim is more often than not left to solve and address the impacts of the crime on their own. In, using air quotes, normal years, that's a daunting task for any identity crime victim. But in a pandemic year, it's especially burdensome, and the impacts can be devastating, as we're about to learn. But before we take a look at the results of the 2021 ITRC Consumer Aftermath Report, a quick word about how we gather the information presented today. In 2019 and again in early 2020, we sent email surveys developed with the help of DSG to identity crime victims who contacted the ITRC in 2018, 2019, and pre-pandemic 2020. In March of this year, we contacted victims who specifically mentioned pandemic-related identity issues when they contacted us in 2020. Together, we contacted more than 5,500 victims and received responses from a little more than 425. It's their responses and words we're going to review today. Finally, if you have a question during the course of today's discussions, please submit it through the chat feature, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of our panel discussion. And with that, here is Eva Velasquez, ITRC CEO, to share our findings. Eva?
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to take about 10 minutes to go over some of the highlights in the report before we dive into that panel discussion. As you know, our Aftermath report is a fundamental part of our education mission, but it's more than just the report. The conversations that we have around these victim responses are critically important. Frankly, they're also very hard to hear. Listening to the emotional and the long-term consequences in their own words, in the words of the victims, it dispels any notion that identity crimes are a victimless crime. And yes, I am still having conversations about whether or not identity crimes are a victimless crime to this day. But this report shows us that this is not a simple or easy problem to fix, and the impact of an identity theft can have far-reaching and long-term consequences for victims. So let's start off with some of those key findings. Next slide, please. Most notable to us were the re-victimization rates, resolution times, dollar losses, and post-victimization behavior changes. So re-victimization rates are unfortunately increasing. Now, we've recognized that for a long time, because we hear from victims every day, that the re-victimization rate for identity crimes is absolutely unlike any other crime type. When we hear to victims that they often refer to their identity theft in terms of a medical condition. It may go into remission, but they never know when it's going to flare up or reoccur. And it's because once their credentials are successfully used, they can continue to be used just over and over and over. And the growth rate from our previous survey to this survey surprised even us. We went from 21% of victims reporting that they had been a previous victim to 29%. And I'll just ask you to consider that. What other crime are you aware of that has a re-victimization rate of 29%? And resolution times they vary considerably. And historically, these resolution times have always been wildly inconsistent. But the number of folks reporting to us this time that their issue is not yet resolved was stunning to me. Less than 1% reported resolution in a single day. And too many, far too many, reported that their issue was still not resolved by the time they took our survey. Think about the victims of the pandemic-related identity fraud. These are the folks that needed that assistance, that pandemic relief that was designed to help them, and they can't take advantage of those programs. When victims of unemployment identity theft are waiting months and months and months to resolve their identity issue, they can't collect those critical benefits that they need just to meet their own basic needs. Now, the dollar losses are devastating. And while most victims are losing less than $500, with 21% saying they lost more than $20,000 to identity criminals, how are we expecting folks to recover from that kind of a loss? I think about what it would mean to me. What would it mean to you? I suspect that for most of us, the loss of $20,000, even temporarily, would have severe consequences. But I think it's important to remember, don't be fooled here. Even with many of the consumer protection laws that we have in place, many of the victims that we talk to are not made fully whole. And depending on how that money was lost, they may have zero chance of recovering any of it. If we automatically assume that these are all credit card losses, which they are not, and that victims can be made whole, which they often can't, we are really missing the big picture here. And I'll say it again, many victims, they're not made financially whole, even when they prove that an identity crime has occurred. There's also the behavior changes. If this was the one tiny sliver of a positive finding, it's that victims often make behavior changes post-victimization. And I really am hopeful that the industry folks and the business leaders on the line here recognize this and see the potential here. You know, we're still having conversations regarding security and seamless or frictionless transactions. But I would like you to consider that you have an entire population here that will welcome some friction. They understand how necessary it is, and they'll be your champions. They'll be your champions of introducing some friction into processes. They can be your evangelists if you just give them the opportunity. I mean, one of our victims, she's now turned advocate, but at the time she was dealing with a very persistent thief that just kept committing the crime over and over and over. And she once said to me, just microchip me already, if that's what it takes. Okay, that attitude's extreme. And of course, I advised her against it. But it's indicative of the willingness and the lengths that victims will go to stop a thief. And I think there's a missed opportunity here to not only give some of your customers what they want, but also to allow them to help you educate others. Next slide, please. Now let's look at some of those emotional and lost opportunity costs that I've been referring to. This crime was devastating even before the pandemic. And when I look at these lost opportunity costs, 83% unable to find housing, 67% of our respondents had to incur debt to meet their financial obligations. In other words, just to live. And the emotional toll, 84% of victims reporting being anxious, 76% felt violated, and a full 10% had suicidal thoughts. This is the first time in the history of us doing our aftermath where we reached double-digit numbers for that particular response. Let that sink in for a moment. 10% of the people that we surveyed were so overwhelmed by this event that they considered ending their life as an option. And for anyone that still wants to argue that this type of crime victimization is just, it's not a big deal, it doesn't have a big impact, well, here's some data that proves just how inaccurate that perception is. And for victims of pandemic-related identity crimes, we really felt like the stakes during this time frame couldn't be higher. The emotional toll, it remains severe, 54% feeling more stressed and violated. But look at those long-term lost opportunity costs. 1/3 of respondents not having enough money to pay for basic necessities like food and utilities. 40% couldn't pay their routine bills, 14% couldn't maintain stable housing, and 13% have been unable to get a job. And just as a reminder, these consequences are not due to anything that these folks did or choices they made. They were victims of a crime, full stop. Victims of a crime, and this is what they're living through. And we simply don't allocate the resources to help these folks. The VOCA funds, or the Victim of Crime Act funds, simply aren't allocated to this population because it's not a violent crime. So therefore it's viewed as less consequential. So these victims get little, if any, support. Of course, other than the support that they get from the Identity Theft Resource Center, but as far as financial assistance and helping them to rebuild their lives, that simply isn't available. Next slide, please. And lastly, this is a more granular breakdown of the types of pandemic-related identity crimes. Unemployment and stimulus-related identity theft certainly top the list, but of course, identity crimes occurred across all of the platforms and programs. I think looking at this data demonstrates demonstrates very well that identity theft often isn't a single event. It's a collection of events, and they have this cascading effect. We require victims to report to multiple agencies, and believing they've resolved the issue, only when it impacts them again, they then have to report it somewhere else. I'll use unemployment identity theft as sort of a example here. No, these folks were victims in the state system. Someone else used their identity credentials to apply for unemployment identity theft in a state or even in multiple states. And they had to report it to that state unemployment department. However, for the victims that were either unaware or it was occurring in multiple states, when those states issued a 1099-G to the IRS, they then had to resolve that issue at the federal level. Now they're talking with the IRS and the federal government. And then for older victims, those on Social Security, if this income made them reach the threshold for income, they could have their benefits either reduced or even stopped altogether. Now they also have to report it and navigate the Social Security Administration system and report it there and go through that process. And it just goes on and on. These are a collection of events that have tendrils. And again, for some victims, it just keeps going. And in closing, I just want to leave you with some food for thought. As I said before, these are crime victims, and often they're not treated as such. So I'm hopeful that this survey and this data will help to chip away at that misconception. And one of the necessary components to recovery from this crime is its one-on-one assistance. These cases are complex, they're nuanced, and a one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. But there have been changes in priorities over the years, and funding for free assistance right now for identity crime and cybercrime and scams and fraud, it's at an all-time low. This is the lowest I've ever seen it, and I have been dedicated to the fraud space since 1996. Without support, free resources like the ITRC and others, they're going to be reduced or disappear. And I'm urging decision makers at the government level, at foundations, corporations, please help me address this need. And while I completely understand that basic necessities, food, housing, medical care are a priority right now, let's try not to be too short-sighted here. Look at these consequences and realize that the folks who are receiving that free help to restore their identity have a much better chance of recovering from these impacts. Identity and digital identity, they are absolutely necessary to function in the world today. And providing those foundational restoration processes and education, it's going to help people in the long term. Thank you all for listening. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to James so we can get started with the panel discussion.
All right. Well, unfortunately, now you have to look at me, but you also get to look at Eva and the rest of the group. So for these next few minutes, we're gonna have a little panel discussion here. Continue to send in your questions. You can use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. We'll answer the questions no matter where you submit them during the course of the discussion. We're going to do this part with the panel, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So feel free to add your questions at any time. So we're going to start with Eva. Everybody jump in as we work through here. But I want to start the conversation by saying, this is a 3-year report. We normally look at maybe a 12 to 18 month report, but for various circumstances, this is a longer time frame. So we get to see some very different kind of trending information. So Eva, when you looked at this information, and you've been looking at it for a while now,
Yes.
what is it that jumped out at you as being something that was both surprising or troubling?
Well, because I've already gone over the key findings, which we all worked on together, I will share something that I think is a positive note. And that was fewer adverse impacts on relationships with others, like family and friends. And it went down dramatically. It was a 20% reduction with that friction and feeling supported with unsupported by family, and over a 40% reduction of feeling unsupported by friends. So the good news here is that our communities, our friends and our family are actually hearing how challenging this is and hearing how traumatic it is and being supportive. Now, if we can just get the thought leaders and decision makers to get the same message, I think we'll really be able to move this forward. But there's a lot of very devastating data in this report. So I guess I'm a Pollyanna looking for the positive note, but at least that was something positive. That's a good change that I saw in this report.
Yeah, well, and that's why we all love you. John, not to put you on the spot of being the anti-Pollyanna, but what was it that surprised you when you saw these numbers?
Well, number one, thank you to you, Eva, and James, and the ITRC for putting together a really amazing report. Identity fraud and financial crimes generally, and their impact on consumers, is something that doesn't not get enough attention. Whether we're talking about in academic studies or just in the media, this report is really important. And I hope that if there are any reporters who are listening in or looking at this video later on, please write about this. Getting the word out about this crime is incredibly important. And so hats off to you all for a really incredible report. But you asked me what jumped out. I think a couple of things jumped out immediately. Eva talked about sort of repeat victims. And at NCL, we hear from consumers too, fraud victims all the time. And the one thing I've learned in over a decade of doing this is that scammers go where the money is. They are looking for a return on their investment. And so if they see that they've got a victim who they can defraud and make money off of, why should they go to the trouble of trying to find a whole new victim? Let's just keep going to that well. So I think the fact that we are seeing the repeat victims again and continuing to increase should be a sign that there is a significant number of people who will continue to need assistance from ITRC and other organizations and from regulators and business community for a long time. This isn't just a one and done kind of thing where you can say it's been fixed with a 5-minute phone call. That's not going to happen. I think the other thing that jumped out at me too was the 13% increase in dissatisfaction with the law enforcement response. I think, I certainly appreciate and talk to all the time the hardworking people at the FTC, at the Department of Justice, at the IRS, at state AGs, and they do yeoman's work. But they can't do what they do on a shoestring budget. And unfortunately, when it comes to helping victims of identity fraud, this seems to have become, a second fiddle to other types of crime. And that's the proof is in the pudding when you see numbers like this, that if you don't give the enforcers the tools that they need to help victims of these crimes, the victims are just not going to get the same level of service and the good outcomes that we all want. So those are two things that jumped out immediately from the report.
So Brandn, you kind of helped us live with this for a while, and you as a researcher, you probably have a different lens to view this through. So what's your takeaway?
Sure. And John did such a good job thanking Eva and all others. I'll just steal his thank you because it was great. But I echo the same. So I work at Development Services Group, and along with a few collaborators, we worked with the ITRC for a few years now and did a kind of multi-pronged study. One of the things we did was to look at characteristics of ITRC served victims compared to identity theft and fraud victims through the National Crime Victim Survey to see what kind of differences there were. One of the key findings was that all folks who are served by ITRC kind of have higher levels of problems that they're experiencing, but they all reported lower levels of mental health problems. And our takeaway from that was that folks who are, not surprisingly, experiencing maybe more extreme or severe versions of identity theft and fraud, they get stuck. They try law enforcement, they try the internet, they may register on the FTC site, and then their problem continues. And so then to be able to have the opportunity to work with folks who are experts in helping them navigate kind of the fraud justice network, as it gets called in the academic literature, in a way that is tailored to them, may very clearly from our work show that they were feeling supported even in the midst of difficulty. And when I look at the results from this year, where there's, as Eva touched upon, a very high increase among ITRC served folks in suicidal ideation, which is clearly happening across the country as folks deal with COVID impacts and a whole host of difficulties. It kind of seemed to me like the value of having a way for folks to get tailored, personalized care in the midst of remediating something that's very difficult, while it's a weird year, seemed to be all the more important.
Well, thank you. That's those are all great points, and I think it sort of leads to the next natural question that I'm going to direct toward John to start, and that is, this data is a little different than what you usually see when you're talking about crimes. The most common statistic you see around identity crimes is how much money did you lose? While that's an element of this, the real focus is what are the other impacts. So why is it important that we know that there is an emotional impact? Why is it important that we know that there are lost opportunities as a result of this? What benefit do we gain by knowing those things, John?
Well, I think the short answer is that if we don't consider those impacts, the emotional impacts on victims of crime, we're never going to get a handle on this. I mean, it's easy to put a number on broken windows or stolen cars or other kinds of property crime, but recovering from those usually involves a call to your insurance company. They cut a check. If my car gets stolen, I've got a rental car within hours that'll help me recover from that crime. But for some reason, when we talk about fraud and identity fraud in particular, there seems to be a certain amount of victim shaming that happens. It's like, well, if you hadn't clicked on that link, if you hadn't given him that information over the phone, that it's somehow your fault for being victim of professional organized criminals. And I think we can't take our eye off the ball about who the people are that are committing this fraud. These are people who are global in nature. They're network, they're organized, they work off scripts, they have very detailed lists of potential targets that they go after. And I think we need to just, when we hear people just, when I hear from a reporter who says, well, how could somebody be so silly as to click on that link? I've taken it upon myself, and I think it should be a challenge for everybody who works in this space and everybody that writes about this space to call that out loudly and often. It is not okay to victim shame victims of identity fraud. And when you do so and you get away with that, you ignore these emotional costs that the Aftermath report details so well. And not only that, but you also make it harder to find solutions, because if people don't feel confident about coming forward and reporting this fraud and seeking out the support that they need to recover financially and emotionally from this crime, they're not going to. And groups like ITRC and others who need the resources to help them with that aren't going to get the resources they need, because the people who figure that out are just going to throw up their hands and say, listen, where's the data? I don't see this as a big problem. So I think it starts with calling out, sort of the dismissal of identity fraud victims, and taking what they say seriously and helping them recover like you would with a victim of any other kind of crime.
Can't tell you the number of times my friends who are in the cybersecurity world will rather sheepishly stare at their shoes and tell me, hey, I clicked on this link. What do I actually need to do now? Because, all those phishing attempts and things like that are so much better now. This is not 5 years ago when, you spelled Bank of America with 2 A's in bank. It's, it's letter perfect spoofed websites. Brendan, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, to build up what John said, one of the things we published about and felt like was kind of missing in academic literature was the recognition that there are multiple. We think about an individual clicking a link when we think about identity-based crimes, but things like data breaches, right? That those are, I'm exposed as a potential victim simply because I have a social security number, or I do banking, or I engage in any of the contemporary things we do in American life. And so as part of our study, we did the survey analysis, we did interviews with folks like many of you on the call who are kind of industry professionals, and then we did interviews with victims themselves. And part of what struck me is in the focus groups with industry professionals, right? So this is kind of the folks you're referencing, James. Inevitably, half the room had a story about their own experience with identity theft and fraud and how it created a barrier for them they had to resolve. Now, often they had access to resources and people they could call and ways to get it taken care of. But it kind of stressed to me that this is not a crime that is limited in terms of income or education status or even sophistication with phishing strategies or other things, right? So I can become a victim even if I'm super careful because of the sort of current structure of the way we do things. And it makes me think about one of the very serious emotional impacts and why it's really valuable to pay attention to it is broad distrust in the systems that identity theft and risk of fraud can sort of sprinkle throughout the ways that we engage in transactions, the ways that we do banking, what it means for us to respond to the IRS and do kind of basic, straightforward stuff. And if we have a decreasing amount of trust from a broad number of people who experience identity theft, I think there are sort of economic repercussions for that, which I think that the emotional part of this start to touch upon.
Eva, before I give you your shot, I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please type it into either the chat or the Q&A function. We're looking at both of them. So no matter where you put the question, we're going to get you an answer. Okay, so Eva, it's yours.
Well, I agree with everything that they both said. So you guys, those are the thoughts and notions that, even I hadn't considered. That's why these conversations are so important. I think for me, what it really comes down to is humanizing the data, because we do have a lot of data about fraud rates and the incident and this occurrence. And even we at the ITRC, we have data breach data about how many companies and how many records. And when we start to tie all of that to feelings of feeling violated, of feeling suicidal, of not being able to get a job, not being able to pay your bills, it actually turns all those data points into the person behind them. And it lets us see the person behind all of that data. And that, to me, is just absolutely key. It is fundamental that, while I agree we have to look at data and we need to use it to measure the scope of the problem, and it has wonderful uses and we need to be reviewing it, it's very easy to forget. These are people. These are people whose lives are being impacted. And this study and the questions that we ask and the responses we get from victims helps to remind everybody, no, these are people and this is what they're experiencing, and it's terrible.
Well, it's a shame that's not the wrap up, because that was a great kind of summary kind of answer to a very good question. I'm going to, for purposes of getting to everybody else's questions and keeping the conversation going, I want to combine these next two questions, and I'm going to start with you, Brandn, because you used a term that you said is in academia about the justice. Forgot the term you used, but it's
fraud justice network.
The fraud justice network.
Mhm.
What is it? Can we do to improve that? What can we do to help the system and the processes for identity victims, so either they don't get one, chewed up in the process, or two, spit out of the process? And I guess there's a third option, which is they just give up and they don't even engage. What do we need to be doing to make this better for victims?
Well, the other one I would add there is folks become vigilantes, right? If you become a victim, you feel like you have to take it upon yourself to find the person who perpetuated this crime against you. And sometimes, the folks we talk to, sometimes you could pull that off, but often, as John touched upon, these are highly organized criminal organizations that are not local, right? They're not in San Diego. So one of the ideas we had, and this is clearly like an academic solution, is, are there ways we can be building or creating collectively, folks who are working in this space, kind of screening instruments that help to determine level of need for victims that could be used broadly across the types of organizations where folks show up to, right? So if you are a local law enforcement officer, you're in a jurisdiction that doesn't have resources to have someone dedicated to identity-based crimes, you have a 9, 10, 12 question screener, which helps you determine what type of victim service would this individual need, right? And Eva touched upon this, and it's in the report, right? There is a percentage of folks who their experience of this crime is, my bank alerted me, my bank took care of it, I feel okay. But there is a much larger percentage of folks who need some type of more intensive support as they try to navigate potentially the IRS, potentially the Social Security Administration, potentially state tax offices, on and on and on. And so that's one thing we thought about quite a bit. And then I think the other piece, and this is not exactly my world of research, but are there ways in which we can think about increasing the criminal repercussions of identity theft, not just focusing on the fraud portion of the equation, right? And then maybe that starts to increase the risk of stealing people's identity and trying to sell it without really trying to use it to perpetuate fraud. And so those two pieces were things kind of as a research team we thought about a bit.
That's great. And you're starting to see some of those increased penalties at the state level.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, in addition to some of the solutions that Brandn talked about, which I think are ones that are important to consider, I'd also add two more. Number one, I think we need to, when we talk about identity fraud and recovery from identity fraud, that takes time, right? In some cases, like Brandn said, the bank calling you up, they reimburse your account and you go on. But for the people who need to spend hours or days or weeks or months or years even recovering from identity fraud, that's lost time. That's potentially lost time at work, lost time that you would spend being a caregiver if you have people at home you have to take care of. And I think that, for people who are, can't afford to miss a day of work to go get vaccinated, which we're hearing about now, taking time to recovery from identity fraud, it's far easier to just throw up your hands and hope it goes away. So I think one step that I would encourage folks in state legislatures and in Congress to consider is whether consumers shouldn't be able to write off the amount of time that they spend on their taxes, they spend recovering from the scam. So victims of financial crimes right now, if I'm an investor and I have investments that have been stolen by a crook, I can write off those losses. I'm not aware of any part of the tax code that allows me to take a deduction for the amount of time I have to spend recovering from identity fraud. So I think that's one area that that Congress could look at to try and help victims of identity fraud. And I think the second thing that we need to do is do a look back. I mean, now that we're coming out of this COVID pandemic, and we saw the levels of unemployment insurance fraud that that the Aftermath report talks about, which is really important. I think it should be a wake-up call, particularly at the state level, to, you know, our reliance on this creaky, insecure unemployment insurance system that is just incredibly vulnerable to fraud. And, you know, that touches not only insurance fraud victims, but it touches all of us as people who, as someone who gets a paycheck. I contribute to my state's unemployment insurance pool of money. And when that money gets diverted from fraudsters, it hurts me whether I'm an identity fraudster or not. So I think it's as a post-mortem on this pandemic experience, and to get ready for the next, hopefully not the next pandemic, but certainly we'll see a recession where more people will be claiming identity unemployment benefits. We need to get serious about how we protect the system from fraudsters who are seeking to defraud, not just the people seeking unemployment benefits, but also everybody who contributes to that system.
Eva?
Well, I'd just like to expand on what John was saying, because that's part of how I see it as well. The cyber issues, a lack of resources in your cyber infrastructure and not making cybersecurity a priority is absolutely fueling a lot of this. And so the changes in that mindset about making this is an investment. Governments need to do it. They need to invest in that infrastructure. Businesses need to do it. Hopefully, this information in this report will also compel them to do it, not just for the business use case. And I know, call me crazy, because I'm like, because they'll see the devastation that's being caused and they will react. So I would, I encourage all the people that are making decisions about how their cyber infrastructure is structured to please make that investment. And then the other thing that I would say to industry is, you know what, can we please have wider adoption of MFA that's mandatory? And if you can't make it mandatory, can you at least make it opt out? Because I think that there's no one solution to this problem. It's so complex. We need to do all of these little things to add up to something significant. But even just making MFA opt out would go a long way, because there are a lot of people that I talk to who really want extra fraud protections. They want to understand what else they can do. They don't know what's available. It's just, they have no idea. And so when I contact here, call them and ask them this question, and they find out that these things are available, they just have to opt into them, they're kind of stunned. So how about we just say, well, if you don't want to be safe, you can opt out. You still have a consumer choice. But I think so many more people would then understand and know that this is available to them, and they would learn how to use it. So those are my two.
Hey, in the 5 minutes we have left, there's a great transition here, because one of the questions, and this is not a plant, an actual question was, what kind of government funding does the ITRC get to support the work we do? And they described it as great work, so thank you. Is it federal or local, or what's the genesis of that? So let's start the Q&A with that, an answer to that question. So Eva, the specifics, but also is it adequate?
Well, okay, first of all, we do get federal funding from the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime. Now, those are dollars that come from the VOCA Act, the Victims of Crime Act. So they're not actually taxpayer dollars. These are the things like penalties and fines that are disgorged from the bad actors. And they go into this fund that is then repurposed to help victims of crime. We have been able to get some of those dollars. Now, they are really diminishing. The availability of funds, the amount of funds, and frankly, the crime populations that are being served through that fund is it's really dwindling, and it's very hard for us to make our case. And there haven't been any grants or cooperative agreements that are targeted to this crime population. We can shoehorn ourselves in there sometimes, and we have been able to get some of that funding, thank goodness, but there isn't anything that's targeted. Historically, it's been very small. There have been a few. The last one was back in 2018. And then we also have corporate sponsors, and we get donations from corporate foundations, places like that. We really don't get a lot of individual donations. We're not that type of organization, so that's not a big way that we are able to fund our mission. But I can say that the situation is not good. It's not looking good for victims because the availability, the types of programs that are funded, we just really don't fit into a lot of them. And so that's a struggle, but that is how we provide our free services, government grants, donations, both corporate and foundations, and then individual donations, just like less than 1% of our annual revenue. And was there a second half to that question?
What should it be? But I think you covered that, so we could move on. I would point out that on the federal government level, 8 out of the last 10 budget cycles, there have been $0 awarded to help support victims of identity crimes. The total amount over the last decade is less than $5 million. Yet it is the fastest growing crime in the United States. So
didn't you do the math, James? And when we looked at the investment versus the total number of victims of this crime, the investment maybe was $1.40 per victim.
$1.41. So less than $1.50 a victim over 10 years. Not that I feel strongly about this.
And can I jump in on this question?
Yep, absolutely.
So I think it's important to note that even though less and less money from the federal government has been going to support victims of identity fraud, the costs of this fraud aren't changing. We're just shifting who's paying that cost, right? So it's being shifted onto the backs of consumers to pay for themselves. It's being shifted onto the businesses whose workers are losing, less productive because they have to deal with this. We're shifting it onto businesses who have to spend more time on the phone dealing with people who have been victims of these crimes. So the costs aren't changing. People who might say like, "Whoa, we just want another government program to solve this issue." And it's like, no. We want to have systems in place that actually save consumers money that they don't lose, businesses that they don't lose lost productivity, and ultimately taxpayers who see their money going towards programs that actually benefit and not into the pockets of fraudsters. So I think when we talk about the need for this at the DOJ and at the state level, we're not, I don't think anybody should think that an organization like ITRC or anybody in this fraud justice network that Brandon talked about is looking for a handout. We're looking for resources to help us fight a crime that's growing and that's costing all of us billions and billions of dollars every year, whether we're victims or not.
Last question. Talk about the divide between identity theft and identity scams, identity fraud. That was one of the questions that's been submitted, that it seems like a lot of what we're seeing today is not what we have traditionally thought of as identity theft, and it's more identity fraud. So talk about that. And is that as my lawyer friends would refer to it, is that a distinction without a difference?
You want me to go first?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So I think the best way to look at it is we look at what the credentials are. And so we have your traditional identity fraud where someone's PII or identity credentials are misused actively. So they were used to open this bank account. They were used to get this line of credit. And that's more the traditional identity fraud. Then of course you have the theft of those credentials. So the ransomware, the hacking, other types of data breaches and intrusions and phishing. And then we have scams where the first goal is to get the victims to part with their money, but the second one is to get them to part with their credentials so that they can re-victimize them over again. So please, and again, we hear from people every day. So send us $1,000. Oh, and by the way, we need a copy of your passport, your driver's license, your medical insurance card, what your DD-214 from the military, whatever else. And people will do it because they believe they're talking to, a legitimate organization, or they're afraid that they're going to be arrested or in trouble if they don't comply. And so I just feel like identity crimes are they're ballooning and pushing out, and they are they're, those fraudsters, they're a crafty lot. They are going to find ways to leverage our processes and our identity credentials and steal the money. So I do think that we have to rethink how we perceive these crimes and how big the problem is, because it's not just identity theft versus identity fraud. It's the misuse of credentials through all of these systems and platforms that is creating new crime types every day.
Well, and to build off of that, one of the things we learned about that I didn't know much about was synthetic identities, and the creation of synthetic identities over time in ways that pieces it together from a little bit from this child, a little bit from this child, a little bit from this child. And then you kind of grow that identity to become an artificial electronic entity that can access bank loans and other types of financial resources. And I mean, to Eva's point, right? That's a pretty new, pretty creative way to be working in this space of how you adapt credentials to be able to engage in fraud. And so I was just kind of struck, particularly as we talked to kind of industry insiders, about how much concern there was of that as kind of the bottom of an iceberg, where we're not going to be able to really understand the impacts of that until 10 years down the road. And again, the need for more resources to be put into both understanding that from a research perspective, as well as what does it mean to provide services to a victim whose identity or portion of their identity was part of a synthetic ID and they had no idea.
Okay, John, you get the last word.
Last word from me is if you are someone who has a loved one or a coworker or a friend who has been a victim of identity fraud, there is no better organization to direct them to for help on how to recover from that than the ITRC. So take that URL, the toll-free number that they provide, share it widely, put it on Facebook, put it on Twitter, on your Insta. The more people who can reach, that ITRC can reach with their message, the better. And I think we'll all be better off for the work that you, Eva, and you, James, and the whole team at ITRC are doing.
Yep. Thank you very much for that. We do have a couple of questions, but we're actually a little over time. We will make sure that your question gets answered, and when we send out the replay of this, along with your actual copy of the 2021 Aftermath report. I want to thank you, Eva. Thank you, John. Thank you, Brandn, for your comments and insights today. And thank you to our audience. You'll receive that recording of the webinar, and it will be posted online for you to share with your colleagues at idtheftcenter.org. So be sure to join us this fall when we release our first business aftermath report. That's going to look at the impacts of identity crimes on small businesses. And join us for our weekly podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Thank you again, and have a great day.